with the group and then also with Kaushik.
Perfect. Cool, guys. Well, thank you for having me, and hope you won't hold that I went to booth against you guys. But no, so thanks Ryan for that intro. My goal here is to really help you guys out, give you a sense of obviously a lot going on in the market now, but each of you guys has an individual story and kind of really, give you kind of different perspectives of how to think about it. So real quick on my background, like Ryan mentioned, I post MBA, I actually started at in Goldman Sachs in their investment banking group. Went to Goldman and got lucky in a couple different ways. Got to work on some pretty meaningful transactions. I led the GE capital transactions when I was an associate, which ended up being some of the biggest deals ever in financial services. So that, in retrospect, was hugely, beneficial for me in my career. Third year associate at Goldman. This opportunity to join Goldman's own private equity fund opened up. So I still had to go through like a fulsome private equity recruiting process. And for me at that point, it was also, it was kind of two or three challenges, right? One was going from banking to private equity as an associate. Number two was going from an associate to kind of a principal in private equity, which is also kind of a big challenge. And then one is kind of more on the industry side. I was focusing on financial services, and this would be more of a generalist type role in addition to financial services. So it was kind of how did I have to overcome those three, pretty big barriers to entry for me into private equity. I was lucky enough to kind of have made that transition into Goldman in private equity. That was kind of a very interesting, like very tough transition as I look back. I think those first 6 months were incredibly challenging to learn the job from someone who hadn't done private equity before. I think the transactional experience helped, but it was only like one component of it. Then I think kind of fast forward to 2018, I got this opportunity as a director and helped build their global private equity business. And so that was a really interesting opportunity for me to be able to do pretty early in my career. And so that also a very incredible experience, but from a different perspective, right? So as a director, you're now responsible for both day-to-day deal, execution and kind of getting the deals done, as well as business development, right? So really putting in the work around the sourcing channels that we had and how do we get new deals? How do you manage portfolio companies? You're also responsible for portfolio companies, right? So whether you're buying or then eventually selling, and then shifting focus a little bit to Elevate, I think, Ryan, to Ryan's question, another thing that I've been deeply kind of interested and passionate about throughout my whole career has been kind of people development and helping people succeed, right? Coming from a non-traditional background, there's certain things that opportunities that I got, maybe I had no business getting into, right? So I think in some sense, kind of help build that for the next generation of what I think are business leaders. So that's kind of the point of Elevate. And then also combining that with bringing in real world professional, like expertise from the industry, right? So the things that I learned the most and that have stuck with me the most have not necessarily been, what I learned in class, but it's been what I've learned from other successful professionals who may have been 3 to 5 to 10 years ahead of me. So that's the whole function and purpose of Elevate, is I bring back either from my network or the network of people that I've been, fortunate to work with, private equity firms, banks, consulting companies, et cetera, to help kind of people on their career journey and kind of bridge that gap between academic and practical, number one. Number two, give them perspectives for how to really succeed in careers from people who've been successful. And then number three, really hands-on like training and things like that, which we've developed to help people. Because I remember back in my own journey, there wasn't kind of that sort of resource out there that I could go to consult. So that's the goal of Elevate. We now are fortunate to work with close to 50 universities. I've spoken at 35 undergrad, top of the 30, I guess 33 of the top 35 undergrad schools, pretty much all the top MBA schools, obviously this as well, to really talk to people about career success, career journey, and really maximizing that process and giving you guys a behind the scenes perspective, frankly, of what really happens out there. So I'll pause there, and Ryan, we can go to the next topic, and I'm sure we'll come back to this stuff.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a nice segue, and that's a helpful background. So as you mentioned, Elevate partners with over 35 undergrad and MBA universities, including Harvard, Stanford, U Chicago, and brings together resources and training from professionals in private equity firms and investment banking, VC firms, and tech firms. So could you talk about maybe and expand on some of those resources that you can offer that would help MBA candidates on this call and some of those partnerships? I think there's a panel too coming up that you had mentioned earlier.
And I'll kind of go through maybe 2 or 3 areas. There's a lot of resources up on the website, but it kind of has modest beginnings. I'll be honest. It was one of my old analysts that said that, hey, can you would love it if you could go to my alma mater, which was Yale, and he was like, can you go speak to their group of students? And I was like, sure, happy to do that. So this was last year, pre-COVID, pre all this stuff. So went out to Yale. He set up this meeting, and I think he soon realized that there's just this need for like we talked about, that bridging of the gap, right? So as far as specific resources, I'd probably mention 3 things that come right off the bat. One is we feature conversations from by professionals on their careers, right? So that's on the website, and I'll send you guys the link. But those are all completely free, obviously, and then it's from people from recently we featured folks from like KKR, Blackstone, Apollo, Carlyle, Citadel, Warburg. So just some of the, again, it's more than just the names. I think it's more about their story. Some of them broke into private equity from consulting. Some of them broke into without an MBA. Some of them did it with an MBA. And some of them, and I think a lot of them just did it from like just pure hustle, right? So I think giving folks that perspectives of what their stories are, but also like what the job entails. The biggest thing is that a lot of people, I think, need to do a better job of understanding like what the job entails and why they'll be good at that job, right? So I think part of it goes to your background. There's people that are going to come with private equity backgrounds and without, but especially for people that don't have the private equity background, I think the biggest barrier to cross is what is the job about and how does my background suit that, right? So this really helps bridge that gap. So I'd say avail yourself of those resources. They're online, completely free. That's number one. Number two is for as far as resources, for people who want more, detailed kind of deep dive into private equity, we just worked on these things called mastery trainings, and effectively you kind of think of it like masterclass, but for these careers. So what I did there was I designed these trainings for careers like PE. We're doing one on venture capital, where I've worked with actual professionals to design kind of what is like a 7-8 hour training that we can give that gives you guys behind the scenes of everything you need to know if you're interested in private equity or going into it, right? So everything starting from recruiting all the way to like how do you think about interviews, case studies, et cetera, but then also into like what the jobs are, what the deal process looks like, what do you do as an investor, what does an associate principal do, et cetera. Then we go into LBO modeling and all that stuff. So it's kind of this, and then we do a whole thing on leverage, which I think is super important, but people don't really understand. So that is something that I think you guys can look into as well. A lot of people from my other MBA schools are in that. And it's kind of very accessible, I think, for especially at the MBA level. The third thing is what Ryan mentioned, is some of these panels where I think top of mind topics. So we have one next Friday, and I'll send you guys actually in the chat. I think that this is just like a Excel sheet that you guys can fill out to get the RSVP for it. But they're basically, I'm bringing back kind of 3 or 4 professionals who are kind of partner, VP, principal, vice president level people at bulge bracket PE funds as well as middle market PE funds. There's a Wharton alum as well from 2018 on the panel to talk about kind of their journey into PE, what they're seeing in the markets now, but also similar to what we're doing on this call, which is recruiting strategies to be successful. And then obviously some of those guys, the person who's going from HBS this summer, she's going as a vice president to Ares. She comes from a more investment banking background. The other person, the partner there, comes from a more consulting background, went to Booth, and so she give you guys a perspective on kind of what are the best things you guys can do in this market, and then you'll hear from real professionals. So that's like another great resource. We have this newsletter out, which I'll send you guys if you put your thing in the Excel. Those are kind of bi-weekly stuff where we feature a lot of this stuff. So it's just really anything that I can do with my network. I saw some of you guys before this chat added me on LinkedIn. Awesome. Happy to connect with you guys and really open up our networks. I think that's the biggest thing I've learned over my career is that you guys probably already know this by now as you're looking at jobs and stuff. Your network is the biggest thing you can invest in early in your career and as well as your experience, right? So working really hard and building a really strong network, I think, are the 2 biggest lessons learned for me, and we can get into how we do that. But yeah, happy to connect with people if they want on LinkedIn or whatever. But I think just the goal of Elevate, I'd say just kind of check out the website if you're interested. Again, I'll put it here in the link in the chat. Those are just some off the top of mind resources that come to mind. One other thing I will say, early stages of working on kind of a recruiting thing where I reaching out to private equity funds and venture funds to be able to take advantage of like the network of like the 40, 50 schools that we have to source like really good candidates. So that's in the pipeline, again, not ready yet. But things like that, where I just want to use our networks collectively to help each other out, be successful in our careers.
That's all very helpful, and I'll make sure to send out those same links when I circulate the recording for anyone that wasn't able to join. But that all is very helpful, and so I think now might be a good time to kind of shift gears a little bit. With the summer underway, could you talk a little bit around pursuing last minute PE internships or potential alternative internship opportunities for the summer that you still
Yeah.
think might be additive to some of the club's members' resumes?
Yeah, sure. Look, this is like the topic du jour, right? And I'm happy to go through this. I see there's about 80 people on this call. Um, I think so much of this, and I'll give you guys my sense, and having talked to a lot of people over the last few weeks on this, but so much of it just is dependent on our individual story, right? So the advice that I'm going to give here is perhaps different for people who have prior, I'll put it into two buckets. One is transaction experience and people that may not have transaction experience, and we can define that in different ways. But the most important thing before I delve into strategy here is you got to sell your story, right? And you got to, like, you have to look at your story from a holistic sense. Put yourself in my position or a position of someone who's recruiting you guys for private equity positions, senior associate, principal, vice president level, right? Post MBA. And there's kind of four boxes that I really want you people to check, right? One is around investment, investment acumen, right? So they're kind of gut for investing. What types of themes, theses, what types of things that are interesting to them, and what are their stances on it? So I think that's hugely important. Number two, I would kind of call that the transaction experience. So this is where there's a bifurcation between people that have prior PE experience and people that don't. And then for people that don't, and we'll get into this, your job is really to do something this summer that can bridge that gap between kind of your pre-PE background, convincing people that you have that ability to kind of do financial modeling, et cetera. Obviously, coming from Wharton, I think that's already one positive thing. But the biggest thing is to develop that, whatever experience that is, whether it's for a family office, if it's for a small PE fund, whether it's for a fund of funds. We'll get into kind of what those experiences might be. So that's the second big bucket that I start evaluating people on. The third big thing is ability to lead and run transactions, right? So this is kind of, you could come from a consulting background, right? Or you could come from a strategy background, something like, but you got to convince me that as a principal or as a vice president or an associate, you're able to lead kind of end to end, manager, associate, manager, analyst, but lead end to end a project or a transaction, and kind of why what you've done in the past will help you do that. So, and we'll get into each of these buckets. So that's the third big bucket on ability to lead transactions or lead projects. And the fourth big bucket is fit, right? So, and this is kind of the most like squishy one of those things. And this is why, like some of the stuff we talk about in networking and the connectivity with people becomes really important. You know yourself, right? If you guys are coming from a strong banking/PE background, then your path looks like this. And there's another question coming up, so I won't eat into that as much, but there's going to be headhunter calls in the next couple months. There's going to be interviews, offers, etc. And there's kind of a little bit more of a defined timeline for that process, be it large or mid-cap. What's going to make the difference there? It's going to be what you've done before, pre-MBA, what you've done in an MBA, and really what you've done this summer. And we'll get to your actual question, Ryan, in a second. But so that's what's going to matter. But for the vast majority of folks who may, or not the vast majority, but the majority of folks who may not have had the pre-PE background, I've seen plenty of people break into it. You just have to, be realistic about the types of firms and funds you're going into, but also really put in the work in building these relationships, right? Especially these middle market funds. This is a multi-month process for a full-time internship. So I want you guys to have, if I'm talking to all first years, I want you guys to have the mindset of what will bridge the gap between now to a full-time offer, knowing that your second year, the vast majority of that, if you don't go through the traditional recruiting path, aka have a traditional transaction background beforehand, you're gonna have to really put in the work to develop that set of relationships and really, work on it month over month until that you get to the March or April of next year and then land an offer, right? So a lot of this, what I've just said, is couched in, traditional markets. So like, where are we in terms of coronavirus and where we are now, right? Obviously, I've heard a lot from our schools the last couple weeks or months, maybe, that, there's hiring freezes or people that may have been going through the traditional paths, they got to the finish line and didn't get there, or some internship just kind of evaporated. I will there's obviously there's a huge negative there for you guys, which I totally feel for. I think to kind of flip that into what are the opportunities that you guys can see, we're still not late in the game, right? So in other words, you guys just need to find something even for 4 to 5 weeks. So even let that start beginning of July and goes to August. So you really even have 6 weeks to try to find something. What I will say is kind of do a broad outreach, continue doing that and really sell your background, right? But understand where your shortfalls are. If you come in without a transaction experience, be like, hey guys, I'm willing to kind of do whatever BD roles or things like that within the private equity fund, or I'm willing to work at a portfolio ops of the company, right? And we'll get into some of this stuff, but really be flexible in kind of the roles that you are willing to take, and also cast a wide net. A lot of times, guys, and I know this sounds crazy, it's often like being at the right place at the right time. You send an email to like a firm that just happens to be like, hey, we're having like a crappy month and we need some help on X, Y, and Z, and they'll just be like, hey, this sounds good. Or you get on a phone with someone who leads you to something somewhere. So yes, it's getting late in the game, but there are still things that are out there that there are actually a lot of funds that might be are looking for help, just because people want help, especially now when they're, practitioners are spending half their time working on shoring up their, portfolio companies. I think people want help. It's just putting yourself in the position to be top of mind, front facing, and really reaching out through your networks or through more broadly to get that opportunity to do that, right? Worst case, you get to hone your story and then, do that, right? So I would kind of say that is one like effective strategy that I've seen that people that have land private equity like summer internship late in the game. I would say even the last couple of weeks, some of the schools I work with, it's just because they're kind of out there talking to people, understanding the needs of the types of funds that they're going into, and then bridging the gap between what they've done historically and what they're able to kind of bring to the table, but with their experience to help that particular private equity fund out, right? So again, we can get into more tactical stuff as we open this up for Q&A, but that's some like guiding principles that I'd like to leave you guys with. And I'll also hit on, I think in one of the later questions, on the actual how to network and things like that as well. But I don't think it's late in the game. I don't care what other people tell you guys. It is not late in the game. It's like you just May the 15th, right? Most PE internships anyway, don't, like in traditional years, don't recruit like April, May anyway, right? So understand that, but also understand that you will get a lot more no's, and that's okay. You just need to reach out to a few more people, right? Because people are like, hey, I don't know what my hiring looks like. I don't know what this looks like, etc. Just be like, hey guys, you don't need to hire me full time. Just hire me for an internship, right? So I think in some sense, internship hiring is even a little less risky for that fund than it is full-time, right? So they may be more willing to give you guys they are more willing to give you guys a chance for an internship versus a full-time, because full-time is like you have to commit the whole time. If there are second years listening, I think it's a little bit different for you guys, and I'm not sure how many of you guys are listening that are are looking for full-times. I think there the strategy is slightly different. There you just need to go like all in, have a plan B that helps you kind of start something in like September 1st, October 1st, even if you can defer it. Potentially have something like that you can work towards, and then use the next 2 months to really, go all out. Be top of mind, get in front of these people, network, and also connect with people, and that will just open you up to a lot more opportunities. I'll pause there.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and I think that touches on the post-COVID recruiting for internships. Kind of fast forwarding to the end of the summer. How do you view recruiting in the full-time hiring practices, whether it's just pushed out further? How do you view that changing kind of in the post-COVID world?
It's a good question. I've put in a lot of, we've talked a lot about this to a lot of different places out in the street. So let me just take you guys, I guess, behind the scenes of some of maybe a few of you know this, but I think a majority of you probably don't. But the traditional recruiting process, right? What it looks like for MBAs. Something like headhunters start kind of reaching out late summer, call it end of July, August. You start having these conversations, and these are effectively, if anyone has been through a headhunting process in the past, these are effectively like the gatekeepers to a lot of these internships. And then this is a kind of a pretty well-worn process in some sense. They'll reach out, and you guys will have these initial conversations. Really important there is to have your story like really nailed down, and kind of why, the types of funds you're looking at, what interests you about them, because and it has to be real, right? You just don't say the things that, yes, part of it's saying what they want to hear, but part of it's also making sure you're getting aligned to the opportunities that apply to you, right? So or relevant to you. So kind of getting your story right is the most important thing, because they'll start making mental mind, be like, oh, this guy or girl has their, has their stuff together. This person kind of still wobbly, so whatever. But for them, for you guys, that's the beginning of the process. So really working on your story at that point. Number two, I think it's as much about then this thing kind of kicks off in earnest. So some of this starts coming back into force, right? Some of the networking relationships that you may have done with some of these funds beforehand, some of the Wharton alumni that you have there, et cetera. We'll get into the alumni networking, which is like the most underutilized thing that's out there. So we'll get into that in a second. But then September, October rolls around is when you start having, interviews, right? So you kind of go through a typical kind of first round, full on interviews with a lot of these funds. And again, this is kind of large funds as well as middle market funds as well. This is the process for those. So you'll go through those interviews. Those are full on like case studies, model building, like, let's go through a sim. We'll give you guys a sim, go through it, and then analyze, like, it's like come up with an investment committee memo, and I can get into what is in that in a second. But like, it's kind of putting together an investment committee memo in like 4 or 5 hours, right? So building a model, all that stuff. So those are pretty intense, guys. So I think just preparing for those, is like super, super important, because that's the stuff you can control, right? The recruiting you cannot control as much, but the stuff you can actually prepare for, you can control. At the principal vice president level, you're doing full-on case studies, full-on investment committee memos, etc. For the most part, obviously there's just grain of salt. There might be variations for different places. So that gets you to like October. And a lot of people end up giving out offers kind of before Thanksgiving. It's kind of how the traditional headhunter process works. That said, I would say of the schools that I like work with or that kind of work with and elevate, a lot of them, I would say it's like 60% of the people end up going the non-traditional path, which is they go do the headhunter stuff, but these things are inherently very competitive, right? So maybe, if you're coming, again, the bifurcation between if you're coming in with a pre-private equity background, this process is a little bit more kind of, for you guys, what I'd recommend is start making your list, start networking, et cetera, such that you're in a really good position when recruiting starts to kind of take advantage. And then also start building your own, like, right now in this market, where would you invest in? Kind of what are the thematics that you're thinking about, et cetera. And then really getting your story down about the deals you've done in the past, what worked, what didn't, what you did. A lot of you probably are coming in from a pre-MBA associate role. So now to put on the hat of a vice president and kind of how you think about thematically why that deal worked or didn't work. What went wrong, what went right, getting kind of all that stuff done and nailed down, as well as your story, like why this fund, why do you want to be a partner at this fund 3-5 years from now? What about our investing strategy makes sense to you? All that stuff that you guys can start working on. Now, if you are kind of non-private equity background, which a lot of these folks might be, it's about kind of getting all this stuff done, right? Your technicals, your story, and all that stuff straight, but also starting to build these relationships with that eye in mind for that full-time offer next fall. So those are more of the on the ground recruiting networking that you guys can do with more middle market type funds, funds that you have potential synergies with. So and for that, what I would encourage you guys to do is go back to your background and really like answer the question, why would that private equity fund hire you? And again, this is not like a pointed question at all. It's just like, what are you bringing to the table that actually is very attractive to me, right? So folks that I've talked to recently, people who've worked in like healthcare consulting or operations consulting, things like that, which are a lot of the investments that are going into space now, whether it's growth equity or private equity, is going into some of these spaces. So really bridging that gap. And to me, and we'll have a healthcare person on the panel as well next week, but that is very interesting, especially in this environment. So like picking the things that are in your background that then you can sell them on, really interesting. The other thing I would do is go broader than just kind of, or grow across the capital stack, right? So start with, large private equity funds, that's fine. But realistically, I would say go to middle market and also go to things like growth equity if that's of interest. Just kind of expand your horizon of what you can look at. The last question you asked, Ryan, is what did it look like COVID, right? Look, this is very kind of correlated to the economy, right, and how private equity goes, but there are avenues to invest even in a down market, right? So think of all the funds that were raised in 08, 09 and how well they have done versus funds that were raised in 12, 11, 13 that haven't done as well, right? So I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities to invest in a lot of these areas. It's a little bit on us to figure out kind of where we want to align yourselves, but I don't expect full-time recruiting, at least where we stand now, and this could change, a month or two from now if this thing continues. I don't expect, maybe timing will get pushed back by a month or two, but I don't expect there to be like a colossal downdrift in kind of the recruiting, at least on a holistic level. But it becomes very firm specific beyond kind of the top firms. Like the top funds will be looking for people. Anyway, I think for the other ones, it becomes a little more situation specific. But I just think there's a lot of areas to invest now. There will be going forward. And so I'm not as like bearish on recruiting as maybe other people are for private equity.
Gotcha. Thank you. And so you mentioned case studies, modeling tests. Are there resources that you would recommend as people start to prepare for full-time recruiting, whether it's staying up to date on news through, Elevate's newsletter, or other things you might highlight people could do during the summer to make sure they're on top of the ball?
Yeah. So I think it's a good question. So I will do kind of two things, two ways to answer this question. One is I will plug a lot of the Elevate stuff. I think definitely, like you mentioned, a lot of the stuff that we have, as well as even our like the private equity thing. I'll put a link on here, but that's like there's a whole module on like building case studies and how to do that. And so really, and you hear of that from, partners, principals, and people who've been through the process. So really check that out. I highly recommend it for folks that are interested. But beyond that, look, there aren't like a ton of great, that's kind of why we created this, because I didn't think there was a great set of resources for private equity specific stuff. There's stuff for, like parts of it. There's like a little bit of LBO modeling, there's this, that, and the other, but there's no like holistically thinking about the industry. But tactically, right, what you guys can do, I'd say kind of 3 or 4 things really, and Ryan, you alluded to some of these things. Number one, really get your story right? So again, work on it and figure out where the holes are, right? So understand what you bring to the table. That's the first thing we talked about. But then understand what your holes are, right? The first thing, if I see someone who came from consulting, is I'm going to say, all right, where's your transaction experience? Like, how are you, convince me that you're in a position to kind of do all the financial analysis and analytics that requires, to be a principal or whatever at a private equity fund. And so it's your job to build that story, right? It's either, look, I worked in the finance function X, Y, and Z this summer, or I worked, in this private equity fund this summer, or I did this, middle market banking thing, something that gives me the confidence that you understand kind of the technical stuff, in addition to obviously going to Wharton. That's a great thing, right? So one is really building that story around your strengths and your weaknesses and really why this place. And part of that is also like, what is your game plan? Like, what are the types of funds you're going to reach out to? Like, what is your likelihood of all these funds? Like, now is the time to really kind of put that work in, that such that you're ready in the fall or late, early spring to do that. The other thing I think is a little underrated is try to see if you guys can get like school year internships. I think that would really advance the ball in bridging that gap. I know we're going to the summer, so your first goal should be getting a summer internship. But let's say you have something already planned for the summer or other things are going on. Think about getting a school year internship. Not a lot of people are out there doing that, especially now. It's like it's everything's remote. You guys can reach out to everyone around the country and then kind of just sell yourself, right? So I think that's one thing. So the first thing is coming up with your story. Number 2 is really start building some of that understanding of that job and understanding of the technical analysis and everything that requires to do that. So we alluded to the Elevate stuff, but also more broadly, just really, that's one thing you guys can really control. Number 3, investing. So the first question, or the second question I'll ask you guys, or we'll ask you guys is, all right, so what's really interesting if you were kind of, if we brought you on, what are the 2 or 3 themes, macro or micro, that you think are be interesting to invest in, right? And the way to really do that is kind of, I would say, a couple different strategies there. One is pick things in your background that are naturally like make sense. So if you've done like energy, like investment banking, or you've done like consulting for consumer retail, I would go and pick 1 or 2 thematics in that space that you're somewhat familiar with, and then talk about it, because you'll already start off with some sense of like, all right, this guy knows or girl knows what they're talking about, right? So I think you start with kind of a thematic, but I think you also then pick things that are not exactly aligned to what you've done before, and then kind of more thematically in the market. Pick a few companies that you think are interested in, et cetera, but really go like 1, and then I'll be like, what's the second, theme you think are interesting? What's the third theme? What's the fourth theme? So really having a kind of sort of like a portfolio like you might be doing for a hedge fund, but it's not necessarily like pitch me a stock. It's more help me understand how you think about themes. Private equity, I think, is all about themes, right? In other words, all these funds, beginning of the year, we'll start off, all right, what are the 10 themes that we're going to invest in this year? And then once we're all aligned on these themes, this is kind of tops down sourcing. Then we go and find interesting ideas in those themes, right? In addition to bottoms up, which are like, we get ideas that bankers come to us with interesting companies, and we source those as well. But I think we really want to get a sense from you on what are those thematic things that are really interesting to you. And then lastly, it's just I would just say like building that experience. Again, I talked about school year internship earlier, but nothing is going to substitute that experience part. You can plan and train and take all these trainings till you're you're blue in the face. But I think you got to like start at least building something that you can refer to as being this leads to this, leads to this, leads to Wharton, leads to this, and this is why private equity makes sense for me. And I think that part is the part that's most variable in kind of where we are.
That's great. And I think we have one more question before we open it up to Q&A, but we've touched on a lot of this, so if you'd rather just switch to Q&A, let me know. But we talked about one of the difficulties with providing kind of an all-encompassing strategy for recruiting is everyone has different backgrounds. And so we wanted to touch a little bit on how the strategy changes for traditional 2-2 and someone with a less traditional background, or for people hoping to transition into PE as maybe a second job after business school. But, if you feel like we've touched on this enough, I'm happy to switch.
No, it's a good question. We've touched upon it a little bit. I'm really happy to see, like, we started out with like about 80 people. We still have 80 people, so we've captured your attention. So I'm really happy to hear that. But I think this question, look, take my own case study, right? Like, I started out in consulting. We entered the job market post the last recession, where I was going to go into finance, but literally my offer like got rescinded, and so it is what it is. So I went into consulting, I went and got my MBA, and then I still had no avenue into, no reasonable avenue into private equity. So to a lot of the people that are listening that are kind of like, oh, is this something, that is even viable? Look, there's one, your career is long. You guys know this as well, like going through MBA, but you're kind of at a really important fork in the road, right? Like the MBA is kind of the last reset point. Unfortunately, where we are with the markets, but everyone's in that boat. So again, we're all in the same boat, and like kind of how you deal with it. And so I would say that the second point you raised, for some of us, maybe the most viable path, if you are really interested in private equity and investing, is to do something like in an investment banking or a management consulting position, and then kind of transition to private equity 1 or 2 years out. Again, look, it's hard, right? Going into private equity at any point in your career is really hard, especially I think as a senior, like associate or what you would go back. I think using your business school experience to really like do if first making sure that private equity is something you really want to do, and so this is the part where you got to investigate it. I'm sure some of the people on this call really know for sure. I'm sure some of the people are not sure, so it's totally fine. We're all on our journey, but spending that time up front to really understand if this is something you want to do, and why, because you will be devoting hours and months to this process, and so you really kind of have to be in it, right, to do it for the next few months or the rest of the year. So spending that time up front to know that. Then if you're like, okay, I'm at that point where I know this is something I want to do or sounds really interesting, more than the other stuff that I'm looking at, great. Now what's your career path? If you've already done, the question was if you've already kind of coming from the 2+2 background, awesome. You're kind of in that, already kind of know what you're getting yourself into. It's a lot easier for folks that have done private equity before to go into PE. But even for you, the challenge is kind of getting that best offer that you possibly can and things like that. So there's that challenge as well. But for the majority of you guys who don't have maybe PE background or don't really see it, maybe the answer is go do something different and then go into that. The other thing I would say is, guys, like, not all PE firms are the same, right? So just this whole thing notion of like, oh my God, private equity, like I really want to do that. That's great. But know that, in middle market funds, there's some funds out there that you're doing much more like a VC or a growth investor, that you're spending 50% of your time sourcing ideas than you are even working on transactions, because maybe they work on 2 deals a year or 3 deals a year, right? So again, not all of these opportunities are created the same, and I think they're inherently realized that as the challenge of this thing is you have to kind of fit in what you think you want with what you bring to the table with what the opportunity actually is, right? So I think that there is where doing that diligence up front, talking to people. Another thing that I think, one strategy I recommend for all you guys is go through funds and kind of their backgrounds. You just go on their website. Most private equity funds have professionals that work there, like principal level, partner level people, and just see like what their backgrounds are. A lot of them, you'll see there's some that are more operationally focused, and you'll see backgrounds from like, consulting, Deloitte, BCG, McKinsey, or, Accenture, whatever. And so those are people who went into PE, maybe even without a financing type background, but they're more operationally focused with an MBA. The MBA bridges a lot of these gaps, but it doesn't bridge all these gaps. So I think use the MBA to your advantage. You kind of have this reset point, but also target your search into those funds that are a little bit more aligned with your background, right? So maybe there's people who've worked in the industry and have done that. And so just kind of figure out where you can get in, because even getting an interview is really, really hard. The last thing I'd say is use your background to your advantage. Like I said this before, but if you have a healthcare background, if you have a technology background, if you have a financial services background, start targeting funds there. And yeah, you don't have a transactional PE background or M&A background, but you really have expertise in that industry. And in this environment, you got to sell them that. Look, I've looked at healthcare companies for the last 3 years as a consultant, or as a in that company, or as a strategic advisor, like whatever the case is. I really understand the space. I have taken these courses or whatever I need to, or this training, this master's, whatever you want to take to build my technical skill set. Thus, I'm convinced that I'm in a good position to go do this. And a lot of people, you'll be surprised, value that operational / technical background. You just got to convince them that you can run a deal and you have transaction experience. And hopefully some of these resources we talked about, like the training stuff, helps bridge that gap. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think that is nice to get kind of the perspective for both backgrounds. So I think now, if you're ready, we can open it up for Q&A. To anyone on the call, feel free to either type in the chat box or unmute your video and ask your question.
I'll clarify. The question was more around international students looking for PE in the US. Sort of how to approach that process, if there's another additional filter that we should apply.
It's a really good question. I'm actually going to do an international panel with investors in like India and some of the other places, and even here, to talk a little bit about both of those, the supply side and demand side of picking up recruiting international students. So I'll send you information about that in the next kind of couple weeks or so. But I think, look, this is a big question, especially in today, and this is bleeding over into investment banking and consulting, a lot of these other industries as well. The ability for firms to be confident in networking or recruiting people, and I think as a result, some of the international recruiting has unfortunately, declined to some of the trends that I'm seeing, especially more broadly. I think and I don't know your particular story, but I would just say, every firm is going to be different. I think the middle market firms, you just have to convince them that like you're the best candidate, and then they'll try to make it work, right? So obviously there's like a couple years afterwards you can work, and there's kind of the visa stuff and all these things. I have seen people be successful in the international process. Obviously maybe not lead with that, but I think you have to just kind of start building those relationships and do it despite that, and then kind of see how that goes. I've seen successful stories. I've also seen some funds that right off the bat ask you like, hey, are you international? Then it's gonna be hard for us to like sponsor a visa or whatever, and that way you can just be like, okay, like I don't have to waste my time recruiting for this fund, right? So it's very firm specific. Even middle market funds are open to it. I would just say it's firm dependent and kind of a little bit on you to sell yourself more than anything. Does that make sense?
We had one question from Jacob. He asked me, do you have an idea for kind of specific resources around modeling? I know we touched on some of the other things available. And then to that extent, do you recommend different things for different stages, whether it's growth or earlier stage investing versus kind of a large LBO?
Yeah, you mean on the modeling side?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's kind of a question that I had in my, even when I was designing this kind of the private equity training. I think look, I don't want to, the modeling is important. I'd say that it's about a third to a third of the importance in the overall process. I think the biggest thing is, for instance, the model that we have in the private equity thing is a pretty full-fledged, intermediate to slightly advanced PE model that you expect to build. So I would say if you can do that and do that without the solution guide, that's kind of all you would need to do the interview. There isn't necessarily a ton of resources, to be honest, beyond probably like the intermediate advanced like model that I'm talking about in the Elevate stuff. I think just building that, doing it, but also the biggest thing, whatever model you guys take is like a lot of people approach these modeling things as being like, oh, it's just like a process. Let me just go through this. But I think really spending that time to like understand, and a lot of the folks that come from banking like understand this, but like really flexing the assumptions and knowing what moves what. Because the biggest thing that we'll spend time on at the end of a case study is, all right, guys, so forget the assumptions you just made. Like roughly, if growth goes up by 5% versus the 10% you have now, what impact would that have on IRR? Or what are the implications of these certain things? Or if we funded this business with another turn of leverage, what impact would that have on IRR? So I think just understanding kind of the why behind the model is as important to building the model. But to answer that question, I would say like check this stuff that we have out. That I think that's one of the most comprehensive things that's always in mind when we build. Being there, because you'll spend an hour in the case study presenting your case. So like, why did you make the assumptions you made? Like, what were the flex scenarios that you built in? Like, what are the three biggest important drivers to IRR? So those are the questions that we'll be asking. So I want you guys to like ground yourself into like what's really, really important for growth in VC. Funny enough, we're doing one in venture capital, so if that's going to come out in the next month. But if you can't wait for that. There isn't like a one size fits all for growth. It's variations of what we found. Obviously, in growth, your assumptions like OpEx, leverage is not as, who cares, right? I think it's kind of more around the growth assumptions, and it's just more on how much is going to grow, and what are the drivers of growth, what can you put in terms of, and obviously we don't use as much leverage in growth equity, so it's that leverage isn't as big a factor as well. There in growth equity, if you're looking at growth equity, I think that interview is much more around thematics, ideas, and just general LBO modeling, as opposed to like, let's build out a full-fledged like LBO start to finish, go through all the sensitivity assumptions, etc. I mean, we build in our model, we have like 4 cases, like an upside, downside, all this stuff. That's about as advanced that I've seen, at any of these funds kind of go through the model and stuff. So I'd say check that out. But again, like I said, that's only a third, right? Even in our training, like the LBO model is important, but it's only one of the 4 modules, right? There's stuff on leverage that I really want you guys to understand. There's stuff on the deal itself I want you to understand. So yes, you need to get that part right, but that is just one component of all the things that you guys need to know to be successful in the process.
Gotcha, that's helpful. And I'll do a quick plug too for the PE VC Club. We have a Google Drive, and there should be, I think, some LBO models on that people can also use to practice.
Excellent.
As we think about actually working during one of these internships, how do you think candidates can get kind of the most out of their experience, maximize what they're learning, and then ways that you can impress the firm and senior people at the firm to help hopefully secure a full-time offer?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I get asked this a lot, mostly from because we're kind of all going remote now, and it's a challenge, right, for people to do that. Traditionally, what would have happened is you go and then you kind of work hand in hand with people and really make an impression upon people, and because you're working alongside them and you learn, and it's a two-way street, right? You learn from people, but you also really they get to see you in action. Now I think it's a lot of it, and a lot of these internships might be shrinking, etc. But I think the ways you really make an impact, one is the work that you're given, like understanding, like you may not have as many opportunities to like clarify, etc. So really, taking those notes and the things that you're in those meetings and things like that, so you know what you're doing, and then really the quality of the work, you should just kind of double, triple, quadruple check kind of the things that you're working on and sending out, because the number of evaluation points for people just shrinks, right? Just by the nature, they don't see you a lot doing that. So I'd just say that's number one. Number two, like over communicating with your immediate team, really important, especially up front. Even if you feel like you're not like working on something right now, be like, hey, how can I help? How can I help? How can I do this? Can I do this? Those types of things really matter in terms of creating a view of someone, especially now when you don't have, as many check-in points, right? The people that hadn't been successful in some of the things, and I hear you're year over year on Elevate stuff, is because they kind of were in this bubble and they were kind of heads down working stuff, but they didn't spend the time to kind of check in with people or communicate what they're working on, et cetera, such that 3 weeks go by and then kind of only 1 or 2 people know what they're doing. On that same token, still taking the time to build relationships with people at the firm, really important. Sure, you can do it via Zoom, you can do it via, Blue Jeans or whatever. I think you guys should just set aside time, like on a Friday, maybe not the first Friday you come in, but just start developing that relationships, because it is going to be important. It's a firm-wide decision if people want to give you guys offers and stuff, right? So I think it's more than one or two people need to be like, hey, this is a good guy or gal that we want to bring back to the firm, right? So let the work quality speak for itself. Pay immense attention to detail and really, get that part right. Number two, over communicate, and really just be around to help, whatever it is, and also be proactive, right? Like it sounds like I'm saying like something very basic, but if there's an IC committee memo that's coming up, be like, hey, can I take this section, right? So that requires ownership, and that requires like a little bit of risk taking. Like you may not know exactly like what you're doing yet, but really be like, hey, I can take but then take an area that you can actually like think you could do. But if it's like a market update or some sort of a industry analysis or something that may not be, you have to own the model from day one of your internship, but it could be like, hey, I'm willing to do research into this industry. Usually the industry research is one thing that investment professionals are like, okay, sure, you can do that, because we would have outsourced that to like McKinsey anyway, right? So I think it's great if you can do some of that and then kind of take that burden off, but also help us understand the space. And it also really give you an understanding of what are the things in the industry that drive an investment, investment case. The fourth thing is like just listen and observe. I know this is kind of like, it sounds like no duh, but like not just listen, but like listen for how people make decisions and investing decisions, especially, right? Weekly or bi-weekly, we would get the entire team together and walk through the ideas that other people are going through, such that we can criticize them, etc. Because PE has become, and it continues to become, much more collaborative, because by nature of that, we all are seeing things from different perspectives. So when I say listen, I mean like listen for how people present ideas in investment committee. Listen for how people present their own internal ideas. Like usually what we do is when we grab coffee, we go by the coffee machine and then be like, hey, what are you working on? And then I'll tell someone, hey, I think that's interesting for this. Am I thinking about it right? Am I thinking about this? You obviously don't have that, but on these calls that you guys have, a lot of your firms are going to have like weekly check-ins and stuff like that. Just listen for themes, etc. And then if something's interesting, proactively reach out to someone and be like, hey, I thought it was really interesting. I did work in XYZ at Wharton or something else. Obviously within reason, you don't have to be like over eager for everything. But I think things where you can add value, just be proactive in finding ways you can add value without going crazy. I'd probably say those are the four things, right? Do good work, communicate, build relationships, and like listen and try to be proactive in contributing things.
Just on the networking front, if we're reaching out to people, what do you think we should highlight? I've tried two approaches where I talk extensively about my background and how it's relevant or what I can do, versus just writing a super short email more about them. Somehow the more about them has worked a little bit better, so I was confused about what approach to take.
Yeah, it's a good question. So more about them, you've said like, hey, I think I found this parts of your portfolio interesting, things like that.
No, more about love your career trajectory. Would you love to talk to me, or would you have a minute to guide?
Yeah, look, I think that the reality is people like to talk about themselves, right? So I think you have to have some combination of that. But I think what you're saying actually highlights another thing that a lot of people take a while to understand in networking is certain things work. So you have to, I think, being a little open to the different strategies. Like one could just be about me, this is what X, Y, and Z. But understand that on the other side, we're getting like 100 emails, right, from people who are introducing themselves. I think there you have to just make a connection to, I think a combination of what you said probably works the most, but you have to cater to what's working for you. So if something's working for you, keep doing it, right? I would definitely say talk about yourself, but just highlighting 2 or 3 things. Hey, I come from this is an example of a leadership or something that I've done that makes me unique, right? Like just bringing something to the table like that actually wants me to make me respond. So that's the one thing that you said. And I think the other part is what you said is like, when you look them up, and if they're Wharton alum especially, or even not, be like, hey, I really like that, I really found it interesting that you transitioned from consulting to PE. Like, would love to get on the phone and hear about kind of how you made that transition. What was that? Because that's very similar to kind of what I'm trying to do. Or I noticed that you worked on X, Y, and Z deal. I worked on something similar in this space. I think just some sense of connectivity, bridging 1 to 2, has always worked for me. But we're all different. I think the key in recruiting and networking is like finding what works for you, and then also finding what's not working, and then kind of stop doing that as much. But you only kind of know that if you're doing a lot of it, and also understanding that people might not respond, and if people don't respond, it's okay to follow up. Like the people that I follow up, I'll give you guys another kind of behind the scenes. People that follow up are the more likely people to get a response, within reason, like a week later, because sometimes you just miss emails, right? It just happens, and people follow up saying, hey, would love to connect, this is my brief background, whatever you want to say. I think that the following up has also really worked for me or people that I've seen in the past. Things that I've seen, before are the questions that we talked about, like networking. Just getting foot in the door is really hard. Number 2 is kind of building that experience. Number 3 is knowing if you're kind of on the right track sometimes is hard because you don't know, if what you're doing is actually like relevant to this PE thing. A lot of people come in thinking that, but then they kind of do other things. And then maybe another thing is like, where do you want to take your career? If there's multiple things. So I know there's a lot of ways. So maybe people can, if folks want to talk about things that are actually they find challenging, I'm happy to address that too.
I got one question in from Michael. He asked, how do you think students should diligence different firms? Given the number of firms out there that look similar, whether it's having operating partners, similar investment styles, how do you evaluate what roles are the most attractive, especially kind of given MBAs are looking at partner track roles?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really good question. And like, this is one of the hardest part, right? So a lot of people, and again, depends where you are, right? If you are early on and you're like, wow, I don't even have, one interview or something yet, then you're like, oh, I'm going to take anything that comes down the line. That's fine too. So, you kind of get your foot in the door, etc. But for people who are trying to be a little bit more like, judicious about where they want to go, I would say, yes, for sure, just 3 things I think you guys can do. One is just go through their people that work there and like understand what types of backgrounds they have. And I think that also gives you an indication of what types of backgrounds it takes for someone like you to be successful there. So if you see the partners there, if you see like the principals or managing directors or whatever, or directors, I think it gives you a sense, all right, so a lot of these people, I touched on this before, but a lot of people have traditional, hardcore banking backgrounds followed by hardcore PE backgrounds. I'm not like that same thing. So maybe I'll be successful here, but am I just kind of wasting my time, or is this kind of the right fit for me? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. There's other places where they're more of this kind of consulting, or there's a mix of different paths, and then you're like, okay, well, there's a diversity of success. So number 1 is the people. Number 2 is, someone alluded to this, but the types of investments they've made, right? Like look into their portfolio and really get a sense, and this is going to help you guys in networking. It's going to help you in the interviews themselves with their portfolio, and I think that's the other big diligence point that you guys can do as you look at companies and be like, is this the right fit for me? And then finally, guys, it goes back to like, where do I fit it into this? So first part is the people, second part is their portfolio, third part is like, where do I, with my background, with my skill set, how would I fit into this thing? How can I convince them that this is something that is right for them? And also me, that this is the right for me to do at this point in my career. Mike's absolutely right. Like going to a partner thing, now you guys want to kind of join a place where you're hopefully there for the next 3 to 5 years, right? On average. So you kind of have to have that in mind. Given the investment that you've made in your MBA, to do that and really reverse diligence this stuff as you go through the process. When you're in the interview or in this informational chats, just figure out like, is this the type of people I want to work with? Is this the right, are they aligned with my mindset? And if not, questions on you on why you are looking at this company. You haven't done a good enough job of understanding why the things you want and then finding opportunities for that. I see a lot of people who, when I ask them, like the second question, like, why do you want to do this? They're like, oh, I really want to be investing in like technology companies that are growing. Then I'm like, why are you looking at traditional private equity that's like leveraged buyouts? You should be looking at VC or growth. So if you at all like start thinking about, hey, I don't love this for this and that reason, really introspect like why that is about what you're looking for doesn't fit here, and then go find the things you're looking for that will make you happy and make you successful, right? So I think this is as much an external exercise as is an internal exercise is kind of what I'd say. One of the questions we love to ask on the other side is like, pick an investment that we've made and what are the 5 questions that you guys want to ask, if you want to diligence that, right? So that is a real question you'll get in an interview. Like, pick an investment in our portfolio and tell me the 5 pieces of data that you want to know to make an investment, or the 5 questions you'll ask in diligence, 5 things you want to ask management team. There's like 50 variations of this question, but just showing like that, like second, third level thinking. People ask me all the time, how do you measure investment acumen? I'm like, guys, there's multiple ways to do that. I can ask you, what are the 3 trends that you're really interested in now? Or, pitch me 1 or 2 ideas of deals that you worked on and why you would or you wouldn't do them. Or this question, pick a portfolio, name in our portfolio and tell me the few things that you want to make, further diligence on, or the 5 factors that would hinge on you making an investment decision to investment committee, or the 5 things we should highlight to investment committee, something like that. And the reason I raise that is because if you start doing that to more companies, you'll start building that thing like inherently, that ability to look at things from in what I call an investor's perspective, which becomes really, really important. I'll pause there. Maybe we'll take 1 or 2 more questions. I don't know, up to you, Ryan.
Yeah, that's perfect. Whatever works for your timing. We got one other question in, and this is maybe kind of 2 parts. So one around, you've mentioned investment themes and things you're seeing in the industry. If you might be willing to touch on some subsectors you find attractive, just as people, it's difficult, I think, as a student to come up with some of those investment ideas. And then the other side of it, just purchase price multiples, if you've seen those come down, what the credit markets are looking like, and just more broadly, kind of the PE industry.
Yeah, man, I'm happy to do that. So there's a lot of things here. I'll try to kind of summarize in a few things that I think are top of mind for people. One is certainly valuations have come down, right? Like to your point, I think, but they've come down for some reason, and some may have argued that it hasn't come down enough. So it's not like you're seeing private equity companies just like, or any investor just like write blank checks, even though we're down, 30%, but also up 30% somehow in the matter of 2 months, right? So I think it's like, yes, things are down, but is there another shoe to drop? So I think we all know that, and we all have our own crystal balls, so I'm not going to sit here and like spew investment advice. But I think the bigger question is like, what do you do now? Everyone's sitting on a lot of capital. Some of the challenges naturally is like debt is harder to raise, right? Like, yes, purchase price multiples have come down, but perhaps it's harder to raise debt, right? So you're not going to get, it's much more selective. That's from a fundamental financial perspective. From an operational perspective is where we're really worried. I think everyone's really worried is what are the implications of some of this stuff on the next year or two. Sure, you can buy something at 6 times EBITDA. Great, you've done a good deal. But if that EBITDA never catches up, this thing, you won't sell it for more than 6 times EBITDA, right? So I think you have to really understand like what are the underlying things about the business that maybe make it valuable. And then as far as other things, so I'd really encourage you guys to think about like operationally what business is more sound. A lot of times we'd look at how they did in prior crises. Unfortunately, the last crisis isn't a great barometer for the type of issues that companies are going through this crisis. And this crisis is affecting a lot more companies, like industries as a whole, like everything from consumer to hospitality to operations to you go down the list, retail and blah 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 blah. So I think just that said, it's given a lot of opportunity for other industries that have done exceedingly well, right? So operations, logistics, healthcare, potentially education, like online stuff, collaboration, enterprise. Enterprise is doing really well, and it seems like all the enterprise companies are 52-week size, and there's a reason for that, right? So I think just picking those areas, I'd say maybe two thematics. One is picking areas that continue are going to do well, especially in a crisis like this, and we don't know how this is going to go. This might end in 2 months and everyone's back to work, etc. Probably unlikely, but there's a chance. Or this could go on for a year and kind of have a slow bleed back, etc. A lot of people can withstand a year, but a lot of people can't withstand a year, right? So one area would be to focus on industries that are doing really well, right? Healthcare, some of the industries that we talked about. The other area is take on kind of a more distressed investor hat. Sure, if you're an investor, great, but I think even kind of some of the funds that I've been involved with, like, were really successful coming out of the last crisis. So thinking about assets and things that you can buy that are potentially cheaper, that could give you really outsized returns in the next kind of 5 to 6 years. And I think you'll also see a lot of people maybe looking at public equity. We talked about this and kind of going into that. And I think the other thing is just the LP base is also evolving, and we don't have to get into that now, but I think that also is going to be impactful. I mean, you read the news the last couple of weeks. There are large funds that are raising billions of dollars to invest in a downturn, right? I think a lot of these guys are raising it. So I would just say don't put any glass ceilings for yourself in terms of where you think you want to go. At the same time, be realistic. Spend time on the things that will actually moving the needle for you guys. You could still spend 25% of your time on things that are like pie in the skies type of stuff, but know that it is going to be harder to get stuff. But look, guys, people are looking. You guys are talented. be confident in your ability and also realistic in what you bring to the table and really sell them on that. And then be cognizant of your own weaknesses. Like if they're, like I said, if you're weak in financials, if you're weak in analytics, if you're weak when I mean weak is you don't have as much experience in, just build those and convince them that you could do it. And I think someone who can say, hey, I use this time to like build my skills and build this X, Y, and Z is so valuable to me as I look at that candidate versus someone who just kind of relies on their background to kind of get a job. So this is kind of what I'd say. It's a crazy time, obviously. You guys, everyone's in their own different journey, right? But the network part that I alluded to early on is two things I'll hit on. One is network and then your skills. On the network front, like continue to build your network, right? It may not lead to a job tomorrow. It may not lead to a job next month. That is the thing that's going to carry on throughout your career. And don't have a very short-term view. Like you'll see people 10 years from your business school who've done great things. It's so much an internal-facing thing, like picking jobs that'll challenge you the most, get you to work on the most interesting, difficult situations that are learning opportunities with the best types of people and ones that you're actually happy about and actually, you know, are like super, you know, impacted by doing that day-to-day work. I think it's hard. I said 4 things that are 4 very, very hard criteria to fill, but that's the goal, right? That's why you go to an MBA to kind of do that. And a huge part of that is your network. So use the network, use each other, help each other out, use the Elevate kind of platform. I'd just say that's the other thing. So much like stuff on it that just been a virtue of that. And then one thing, and the second thing is building your skills. There's things you can control. Don't worry about the things you can't control, right? Which is the market, everything around you. Everyone's in the same boat, right? It's not just like, you know, Wharton is on some magical, you know, carpet ride. And I'm speaking at Chicago later this week and I'm telling the same thing, right? Like we're all kind of in this together. So do the things that you can on an individual level, building these skills. Because the biggest thing you can do now coming out of this, let's say, and a lot of the first years are actually in a position because let's say firms kind of start back recruiting in the fall, you kind of want to be in a position where you focus on getting a good summer internship and then justifying it. Then you can build your story, but focus on getting a good summer internship and then at the same time build your skills and knowledge, etc., such that when this thing comes in the fall and spring, there was a time before COVID and there will be a time, you know, things are slightly more normal, right? So just keep sight of kind of a little bit more of a medium-term horizon, and then trying to get ready to go on that path. Just like check out the stuff we have, especially the training. I think it'll be really helpful for you guys, especially with the MBAs. Has been really helpful. So anything we can do, and then also give us feedback on things, other types of things. But yeah, I mean, I just kind of wish everyone the best of luck, and reach out if you have questions. I think, and just kind of participate. That's what I'd say.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been incredibly helpful, and I'm sure if we're in person, there'd be a big round of applause. But it seems like a lot of people signed up for the Elevate and the Google Doc, which is good, and really can't thank you enough.
Yeah, man, no worries. I appreciate it, guys. Best of luck.
And the panel is next Friday. Sorry, I just wanted to...
So the panel is next Friday. I'll send you guys, I guess you can... A lot of people have actually already signed up, which is pretty cool.
And we'll circulate it again to the club with this video as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Absolutely. I think you have a Wharton alum, and we're just gonna. I just say try to submit. For you guys, and I just sent you the link to that on this chat, guys, for people that are there. Sign up there. I'll send you guys all the RSVP. It's an hour panel. It'll have at least 3 or 4, at least 4, maybe one other speaker. We'll talk a lot about this, a lot of the things we talked about, but also hear from their journeys on what's successful, what's not. What are the types of things they're looking for at their funds, right? They're kind of 2 of them are more in the middle market space, 2 of them are more kind of in the bulge bracket space. So kind of, you'll get a chance to ask that, as well as I'm inviting kind of all our MBA students. So I got to figure this out. I got to find a way, I think, to kind of help everyone network if possible in this type of time. So if you guys have ideas, let me know. We're kind of now in, about 10 MBA schools. So if that would be helpful, I'm happy to organize like an AMA or some sort of a networking session where people can just share stories, because that is the other thing that's really lacking now. Without informational sessions, without some of these events, I think that's the other part that I feel like has been pretty lacking here. So hopefully we can use the collective, network of the 50 schools we have to help each other out. So thanks for having me, Ryan. Thanks everyone for listening, and best of luck. Look forward to staying in touch, and definitely be in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks again.
Yes, thank you. Cheers. Bye.